Chaos Warriors are all well and good. Yeah, they're hard, they're durable, they're going to lay down some hits, but sometimes you're going to need a little bit more backup. And that's where the Theridon Ogroids come in. And that is exactly what we're going to look at today. These big bully guys, literal bulls, angry bulls with big axes and banners and other cool things. And yeah, I need some of those in my army. So let's get on it after this. Hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Wayne. Hope you're all right, and thank you for joining me again. What we're going to work on today then? Well, it's going to be the Theridon Ogroids. I think that's what they're called. A few videos back, we looked at the, what did we look at before? What's that dude's name? The Wizardy Bull. It's still the Wizardy Bull. Thaumaturge. The Thaumaturge. And we also kind of figured out that that perhaps wasn't the way to paint the rest of these bull guys. Now, that was a very specific instance of one of these guys. Is from the same sort of species, but is functionally different. How am I going to paint these Thermoroid, Ogroid, bull guy things? Well, I want them to be pretty dark. Yes, I know, I hear you say it, but Wayne, everything you've done so far has been pretty dark, pretty simple in this army. And you're absolutely right. It has. And it has for a reason, because I want it to be fast and I want to get this on the tabletop super, super fast. With that in mind, I wanted to come up with a scheme that was somewhat reminiscent of the origins of these guys, the literal bull element of it. So I wanted to keep that color scheme in mind, how large, like bulls really kind of look at musculature that's kind of evident in some of the bigger species. And I used a lot of that of inspiration to figure out how we were going to paint these. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't do them a little bit more colorful if that's what you want. Fitting in with our larger army scheme is really important. We've got the unified base scheme there, and we've got an understanding of how we're going to paint armor already. So we can start off really, really simply. A lot of what we've already done is going to lend itself into painting these much faster. So we'll just recap on what we've done there. But before we do, if you've not already, do give me a subscribe. If you're enjoying the content, leave me a like, leave me a comment, whatever it is you want to do. If you want to interact with me, that's fantastic. I'm also doing a podcast now, Warhammer and Wings. You can find us here on YouTube, or you can find it on Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts from. Do let us know how that's going as well, if you're enjoying it. That's everything for now. So let's crack on, get to the painting desk, and get these Ogroids painted up. Double quick time. Getting straight into it, we're going to use a little bit of underpainting. We're going to do that with this warm grey, stonewall grey, and an off-white. But don't get too caught up on the brands or the colours. Just a warm grey and an ivory or something like that. Now, as always, I base coated this entire model using a black primer. Doesn't matter what kind, just use whatever you've got to hand, even an airbrush, or just brush it on and you're good to go. That's going to set the base up for what we're going to do. We've done this a fair few times now, but make sure your brush is a little bit damp, a little bit moist. It'll help the paint come off and won't be as chalky. And we're just going to use that grey in the first instance to give the model an all-over dry brush. Now, concentrate more on the areas where we want to pick out some details. So thinking about around the face, even introducing some texture on the muscled areas, using a little bit of stippling perhaps. Something that this style of painting really lends itself to is the introduction and the creation of textures in a very easy, straightforward, low barrier of entry manner. Now, looking at something like this banner, we can start to work our way around it using a normal dry brushing technique. But what we can do then is start to load a little bit more paint on the brush and control the direction of the dry brush and introduce something like texture. Now, thinking about fabric, often it's a weave, and thus you get a crosshatch kind of texture. So going in one direction first, and then in the opposite direction secondly, you can create the illusion of a really subtle crosshatch texture, giving more variance to the model. This is really important when you've got something that's a really large area, a really large flat surface like this. Even though we're going to paint over on the top of it later on, having that texture really helps convey the realism of the model. It introduces something else that's visual to look at, and it's something that distinguishes your model from other people's models, and it's dead straightforward to do using this technique. Now, is it going to be perfect? Absolutely not. But for tabletop standard, it's going to sell it and give you a real presence there. Depending on the sort of texture that you want, you can vary this up going from standard dry brushing to cross hatching to stippling. It doesn't really matter. More variance is generally good. Just make sure that you stick with one style in a given area. Otherwise, it will start to look quite messy. And you don't want to go too bright. The idea here is to stay subtle. Now we've worked our way around the model with that warm grey, let's start to really concentrate on picking out some of the details using the off-white or an ivory, it doesn't really matter. Now straight away we're going to work on the face, and that's the predominant area that I'm going to work on. Why? Well, in my head the colour scheme is going to be somewhat varied. We're going to have a different colour on the chest and the fleshy parts compared to where I imagine there would be hairs and more of a textured approach on the back and the arms and such. So thinking about the inner forearms, perhaps the inner thighs, up on the chest, anywhere that's not naturally shadowed, I'm going to start to put in some of this tone. You might want to think about how you're going to have the model lit later on. For us, we're going to have it lit from the bottom up because of the glow that's coming from that pink lava like substance. So it may be worth putting some of that where we know that the light is going to be shining, and that's going to give us quite a nice start to the effect that we're going to build on later on. Now we talked about texture earlier, we're going to introduce some more texture, and using a little bit of a sponge, dampened ever so slightly, we're going to go back into as paint, either the grey or the white, depending on where you want to put this on the model and the kind of texture. I'm going to go with the grey, and we're going to start working on the banner. I want to give a much more, what's the word? It just needs to look more rustic, more like it was thrown together. So I'm going to use my tweezers, a little bit of this sponge, and I'm going to start to stipple on some more texture to this flag. That's the majority of the preparation done, so let's get on to the metallics, and I'm going to use a dark gunmetal and the brass. That's going to let us start work on the armor, and well, we've already done the majority of the preparation now, so we're just going to again go back in with some dry brushing, pick out the eye points of the armor, and work our way around the model as we did with the Chaos Knights in previous videos. If you've not checked those out, it's probably worth going back and having a look at how we did the metallics in a little bit more detail, but it's dead straightforward. Laying down the foundations using the dry brush in the first instance, and then we can start to put on some colour onto the brass then, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing. Anything that we don't want to be the dark gunmetal color, we're just going to go over the top of with the brass, and the gunmetal is going to give us the natural highlight. So working on in exactly the same method that we've just done in the previous step is going to give us a different color, a different finish with absolute minimal sun effort. And it's going to be exactly the same process for the next color, which is going to be a gold. I'm going to use Retributor armor just to add a little bit more visual flair to this model, because this seems like it really does deserve something a little bit more. The process is exactly the same, so we won't cover it in too much detail. And again, the last thing we're going to do is put some highlights on there, and we're going to use a bright silver for that. Across the board, I'm going to use this aluminium color, and again, it's just some selective highlighting at the very top of any of the colors that we've just put on. Don't go over the top with this because it will start to make things look a little bit strange if you do. Just really concentrate on the very top surfaces or the bottom surfaces, depending on where your light source is coming from, and you should be done with this step. Let's work on a little bit of the armor then and use some of the black Templar just to block in some of the colors so that it matches what we've done in the rest of the armor. And of course, none of this should be new to you by now. This is kind of what we've done with the Chaos Warriors and the Chaos Chosen. It's really just applying it in a little bit of a different way than we have previously. So it's building on the techniques we've already used across the army to start to bring some variance, but also consistency in what we're doing. And in terms of an approach, this is what army painting is all about. It's taking those easy to use techniques that you know how to do and you've done a couple of times before, and then perhaps just changing the order that you apply them and changing up the color schemes with different elements across the model that you're painting. That way you get the consistency, and you've also really done all of the hard work because you've already thought about the color scheme ahead of time. We are really just revisiting here, so we're going to pull out as blue as well, and we're going to apply some of that to some of the elements around the model. So looking for the wrapped, this is exactly where we applied it on all of the other models, and we're just going to lay down a quick glaze across any elements where we see the wrap, and that's just going to add another quick visual anchor to the rest of the armor. But what about all of the leather on this, you ask? Well, you're absolutely right. when we're going to use exactly the same technique we've used several times before here. Using the contrast wildwood paint, I'm going to lay down a thin coat of this, perhaps two, because I do want it to be quite dark in contrast with what's going to be quite a bullish colour, I think. So we're going to have a lot of browns and earthy tones on here, so I do want this to be perhaps a little bit darker than we've done previously. I'm going to lay down this across the board. You'll notice as well that I didn't pick out the blue wrap on the sword. I saw that later on, don't worry. Just make sure you work around slowly and carefully. I think at this point, other than the bandages, we're in pretty much a good position to start actually painting the model now. So let's get those bandages done straight away and we can actually start painting this guy and doing something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to use Agaroth's Dune. Deep in concentration at this point, I was happily applying paint to the bandages, contemplating the meaning of life when I thought, you know what? I need to paint the entire banner this colour as well because it's going to be a really good field colour to put the chaos symbol on later on. It's not going to be too dark and it's going to give me enough contrast that when I apply the blood effect later on, it'll stand out from a distance and it won't just look like a smudge in an already kind of muddy colour scheme. So that's something that was a real positive. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to use it on the bandages and I'm going to use it on the banner, I might as well use it on the hair as well because it's going to give me a blonde sort of hair and that'll be different to what I'm going to do on the other Theridons. So each one would be functionally different, but still have the same tone and a same value. So I went ahead and did that too. Let's jump back into some snakebite leather and adding some more interest to the various sorts of materials that we've got around this guy. So we've got the leather, we've got the banner, we've got the hair done. Let's concentrate on this loincloth as well. Slightly different to what I've done on the previous tutorials with this color. I'm going to do 2 to 3 coats because I really want to build up the richness. The reason I want to do that is because, as I've spoken about before, this entire model has got a very similar colour palette. It's all going to be browns and earthy tones, so I really want this loincloth to pop and stand out. The reason being then it's going to draw attention up to the face, which is the important point of the model, because we haven't got the same amount of glow on this as we have on some of the others. And whereas on the other models, we've got all of the glow in the face, so we're automatically pulling the viewer to that. On this, we don't have that, so we want to draw the viewer's eye up to the face of the model, ignoring some of the other glowing elements that we do have on this model, like the tattoos, pull them straight into the face. So adding a darker colour at the bottom and a lighter colour at the top of the model helps you go from light to dark. So it's a bit of a trick that you're almost manipulating the viewer into looking where you want them to. Yes, I am procrastinating now, so we're going to paint the horns next, and we're going to do that using Skeleton Horde. Let's get those done. Any bone details on the model, we're going to pick those out with Skeleton Horde. And again, it's another very similar tone, but we are going to add like a little bit of black later on to dull it down towards the ends as you would expect. As I said earlier in the video then, I want to have a lighter tone on the face and on the chest, on the inside of the arms, etc. and a darker, more fur-like colour on the rest of the model. Now I'm going to use Guilliman Flesh for the former and we're going to use Gorgrunther Fur for the latter, but any pale flesh tone will work and then a darker one later on. Now to mix these together, I'm using contrast, so I want to work fairly fast and we're going to use a moist brush. Now we can come in later and wick some of this off, but you do want to work fairly fast and we're really going to start to see the utilization of those of underpainting we did right at the start. So having that ivory colour, you can already see we're getting incredible detail on the face with almost zero effort at this point. I'm going to work my way around thinking where I want this. So as we've already established, we're going to have some on the chest, some on the arms, perhaps working into the back. It's entirely up to you. It's a rule of cool. You could even look at some reference images, and I did for this. I looked at some bulls. I say bulls, they're absolute monsters. I mean, some of those animals are absolutely huge. There's no hard and fast rule is what I'm getting at here. So where you want to put the blends, that's entirely up to you. Again, though, thinking about the values, we want to draw the viewer's eye towards the face. So having a darker hue around the face is naturally going to frame it, naturally making it stand out. And since we've already put some thought into darkening down the bottom of the model, it makes sense to draw the darkness upwards. But when I hear you say, you're going to have a lot of similar colour tones in the same area and it's going to make everything just mush together as one, isn't it? And well, yeah, you're right in some respects, but remember what we did in previous steps? We thought about different textures and we're going to use the texture to differentiate between similar colours. giving us differentiation between them, differentiation between different areas of the model by using those different textures. So things that can have a same or similar color value, same tonal value, same temperature, can look drastically different. Also, we can think about picking things out with additional details, additional highlighting, and we're going to do that in a later step. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But this is where planning a model and thinking about what you want to achieve beforehand comes into play. You don't have to paint every single detail in a different contrasting color. Now we've got all of us flesh tones done, let's work on getting that fur-like texture to read as what we want it to read as. Now we can always come back in and add multiple coats of this once elements have dried, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll darken it down into the shadows. Again, that will give us a richness and a depth, utilizing that dry brushing step that we established right at the start of this process. Let's get the color on in the first instance, then let's get the blend into the flesh tone and see where we are from there. As we've talked about a number of times now, making the brights brighter and the darks darker is going to give us contrast, and contrast is what's going to help bring out the detail. And we'll do that by using multiple layers of Gorgrunther fur. We'll darken up the shadows into the crevices between the muscles that we've already got base coated black because it didn't pick up any of the paint in the dry brushing step, but we want to reinforce those shadows of not just reading as black, but reading as very, very dark brown. It'll almost pick out some of the texture as well. It gives you a really subtle variation in the skin tone, like the musculature showing through what we can assume is some type of fur-like texture. If you've ever stroked a horse or a cow, it's that sort of texture that we're trying to get. Now, from our initial preparation steps, hopefully that's going to start to show through and the color just won't be this even sea of color over a flat surface. You can already see here that we're building up variation and texture. Again, make sure you're using a wet brush to help blend it together and you'll work your way through it in no time. Let's jump back to that bright silver that we used earlier and let's start to pick out a little bit more detail around the model. So things like this chaos star need to stand out from the loincloth a little bit more. So coming in with this silver is really going to help. And we'll just work our way around the model, picking out any bits and pieces where we just want to add a little bit more separation or a little bit more interest. Some of the golds and the brasses can be quite muddy with the rest of the color palette because of that similarity that we've really tried as the hardest to establish. So pulling things out and making things pop just a little bit gives us a little bit of separation where we want it. Now, we talked earlier on about picking things out using some highlighting and creating a little bit more texture, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. What I'm going to do is get my wet palette. I'm going to get some colors on there. So I've got like a pale yellow, some fleshy colors of brown and off-white. These are really going to help us pick out those leather details, some of the other cloth types that we've got, and certainly start to pick out some elements on the skin and even add in some more additional textures. I really recommend using a wet palette for this, setting up some blends, and then you can start to figure out how it works best for you. I'd strongly recommend as well having some photo reference here for the kind of textures you're creating. One of the things that I tend to do is if I'm out and about, I've always got my phone with me or a camera. I take pictures of various textures, but a simple Google search will give you a load of reference images, and I tend to keep them next to me on my iPad, something like that, or even just use my phone. Bearing in mind, these are reference pictures. They aren't something that you need to copy one-to-one, and certainly at the scale that we're painting at, creating a texture that is a one-to-one match is quite difficult and often not needed, bearing in mind that we are viewing these models from, 3 to 4 foot away from the majority of the time, so don't worry too much about it. Contrast is good in this respect, so if you are wanting to have the detail on there, going a little bit brighter perhaps is the way to go. Don't forget as well about the different textures that we've talked about on the model. So how a leather looks is very different to how a loosely created fabric looks. So leaning into that area about how you apply the strokes to the model, and that's going to help you again all the realism of what we're trying to create. Once we've spent so much time trying to draw the viewer's attention to the face, then let's give that face a little bit more attention, and we're going to use the same color palette that we've already got on this wet palette, just changing things up a little bit. So mixing the color to be more akin to a flesh tone, adding in a little bit of that brighter brown, picking out the eyes, and we really start to pull out some of the details there. Try to stay away from the shadows because, again, as we've established, the shadows is what gives us the contrast, and that's what we want to maintain throughout this. Now, you can put as much or as little detail in here as you want. I would strongly recommend using a brush with a nice sharp bristle and varying up the techniques. So Sometimes I'll just be using the side of my brush to pick out the teeth as I am here, or I'll be using the very tip of the brush to dot the eyes as you've already seen me do. Now the banner, we want to get something on there, and I'm going to use a pencil, just a standard lead pencil, to draw on a simple design. We're going to use the chaos symbol, and no, it's pretty standard, it's what's on the box art. So I'm not going to deviate too far from that because pretty much that's what I want my army to convey. It's the chaos undivided star. I don't know what else I could possibly do on here, but it's the path of least resistance and it's going to help me get this guy done. So I'm going to loosely sketch over the top of the banner that we've already painted in graphite. And the reason I'm going to do that is it's easy to rub off later on if I make a mistake, but it gives me the guide that I need before I start laying paint down, because the last thing I want to do is have to start over again on this banner, and the light reflects really nicely off it. If you hold it at the right angle, you can see where you should be painting. Ensure that your pencil is nice and sharp before you start drawing this on. It makes things a little bit easier. I'm going to use one of my favourite Citadel paints, Rakarth Flesh, to block in the colour of this chaos symbol on the banner. And I'm going to, again, get this on my wet palette. That just lets me control the consistency a little bit easier. Using a nice sharp brush, one with a good tip, that's going to make things a little easier and allow you to maintain control and create something that's nice and clean. All you're going to be doing is tracing the lines that you already drawn with the pencil in the previous step. Now, take your time here. You don't want to go too far. It's much easier to work in thin layers and work up than it is to go oversaturated and make a mistake. How complicated you want to do the design is entirely up to you, and you can come back with a little bit of white added to this mix to brighten up, do a little bit of veg highlighting on the symbols themselves. Perhaps you want to reinforce some of the curves or of other elements with a little bit of black. That's entirely up to you. I don't like to go too far with this because in my head, they're not going to be overly proficient with creating very ornate banners or anything like that. For me, the more rustic look kind of sells into the narrative a little bit more, and that's what I'm trying to create here. This wouldn't be one of my Slaves to Darkness models if I wasn't going to have a little bit of OSL, a little bit of that glowing pink on here. So using a white ink again, I'm just going to pick out the tattoos and perhaps the eyes on the banner as an element that I want to be glowing, somewhat imbued with chaotic power. Now, we're going to imbue it with chaotic power by running some very thin white ink into the very thematic brand marks on it as well, which are also like tattoos. Just look around the model for these, make sure you don't miss any, and run your thinned white ink into there. Before we get onto the last element of the OSL, let's get some blood on this banner. I'm going to use some dry blood army painter, and if you excuse my head getting in the way, I'm just going to blow on that blood and it will appear as a blood splatter on the banner. And it's at this point then that we're just going to use our standard method of getting the OSL on there, which is some white ink through the airbrush. Everywhere we've put the white ink thin down onto the model, so around the tattoos and the eyes. Using the white to give a little bit of a halo, so that's going to read as the glow when we put the pink over the top of it. And then it's literally going to be the case, as we've talked about many times, swapping backwards and forwards between the white and the colour, placing back and forth to really sell the OSL with the whitest. Remembering to always make sure that the whitest, brightest point is wherever the light source is emitting. The final step is to come back in with us white ink and a very sharp little brush and just finish off any little details right in the center of any of the glowing elements just to really sell it. And once we've done that, let's take a look at what we ended up with the Theridons. I'm really happy with these guys. They came out much better than I was expecting. That's not to say I was expecting them not to look cool. That's not the case. But the end result is very much exactly what I was going for. It's got some hair of realism about it. The color scheme does look exactly as I wanted it to go to. Perhaps there could have been a little bit more differentiation between the front, the chest of the model, and the darker fur-like texture at the back. And thinking about texture, that is the one point that I'm not happy about with this. Had I have spent more time working on these models, I would have definitely put some more effort into making the the fur, the hair that would absolutely be evident on these models' backs. I would have perhaps used some sort of texturing technique or micro texturing, perhaps if I was going to go that far with it. But thinking about how much time I wanted to spend on it, it wasn't really viable. So working with what we had, they've come out exactly as I would have hoped. As I said earlier, do let me know if you like this sort of content. Tell me if it's good, is it bad, what else would you like to see me do? I'm really excited that we're getting closer and closer and closer to getting this army on the tabletop and ready. That's it for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one. See ya.